Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
It's the Scary Stories Night Before Halloween special.
Happy Halloween, everyone.
I'm Nancy Levonian in Hollywood, joined by the stars.
Your old pal Bigfoot, Henrey Lee Dogman, Madeline Starr, PQ Ribber as Dr. Death,
and more. Possibly. We've got an extra long show for you tonight, and we'd like to kick it off with a scary werewolf tale that we call
Halloween Parade Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story about a werewolf that didn't take place out in the wilderness. My story takes place in New York City on Halloween. This was back in the late 80s or early 90s. Those were sort of lost years for me, so they kind of jumbled together in my mind. I was at the village Halloween parade that night, and although technically alone, I kept running into friends, enemies, and frenemies all night. I drifted from one tribe to another, saying friendly things, but still remaining entirely on my own. That's just the way I am. I won't kiss butt to gain status, and when I'm offered status, I head in the opposite direction. I don't want to be in a tribe, and I don't want to compete. I'm not trying to win the awards of your tribe. I could never follow all the rules it must take to be accepted by normal people. I'm just an artist. I wasn't put here to fit in. I was put here to observe and comment. Once you join a tribe, then you have to say what it is acceptable to say in that tribe, otherwise you face banishment. If you see a UFO, but your tribe only believes in Bigfoot, I wouldn't want to be you. Artists are subject to prejudices, same as regular people, but we have a better chance of gauging what is actually happening simply because our perspective is different. We're standing on the outside looking into the trenches of regular people's lives. When they understand what we're saying, we get called prophets. When they're annoyed by what we're saying, we get strung up, often quite literally. But the end results don't change the basic nature of the artist. So, that night, right there, on the streets of Manhattan, I saw an actual werewolf, and I was the only one who understood what I was seeing. The others literally glanced, then looked away. There were other costumes more flamboyant to look at. Why, look at this guy covered in all that hair. Did he glue it on? The guy looked like a mess. People would glance, feel embarrassed, and then look away. And in this manner, an actual werewolf was able to march with all the people in the Halloween parade that year. I saw him before he got all hairy. I know he was really a human under the fur. I saw him transform. He collapsed behind some garbage cans, and I was the only person who walked over to see if he was dead or alive. It turned out he was somewhere in between, wiggling all over the ground down there. I was trying to remember where the closest payphone was as I watched him. I wanted to call for an ambulance, but I also was trying to figure out what to tell them about this guy. The word seizure popped up, and I thought I'd tell him he was having some kind of a seizure. Then I looked at the street sign to see what corner we were on. The crowd was pretty thick, and I knew the going would be slow when I saw a payphone 1 block away from me down one of the less crowded streets. I took one more glance at the man behind the cans, intending to run down to that phone next and get him an ambulance, when I saw the fur. The hair, the fur, whatever it was. He was becoming covered in the fur of an animal, and his snout was pulling out like he was growing bone and cartilage in his face and mutating in front of me. I never made that phone call. I just stood there and watched the rest of the transformation. It was the most incredible thing I ever saw. and I find words incapable of explaining what I witnessed. It was sickening, and yet kind of beautiful. It was nature itself, and yet it was very unnatural too. There was a point where it became clear that the transformation was done, but this was no Hollywood monster in front of me. The fur was all uneven. It was not shaggy the way a dog might be. It was like something which had been thrown together instead of being fully born. This was a living creature that nature had rushed. I nearly offered it my arm to help it up, but it clawed at me and growled loudly, so I backed away quickly. Wherever it went that night, I followed it, watching from a distance. Even in that crowd, this creature kept plenty of space all around him. Nobody wanted to go too close, and in that way, he never had a chance to do any harm to anyone. The thing walked like a man, but its legs were wrong. It walked like it had been drinking. I wasn't sure if that was because it was this creature or if the man had just been drunk when he transformed. It's not a subject I've ever seen discussed in Wolfman movies. At some point, I ran into one of my prettier frenemies, and she occupied my attention to such a degree that I lost sight of that werewolf and went off to have other adventures. But if anyone ever tells you that werewolves and vampires and ghosts and aliens couldn't possibly exist in a place as crowded as New York City, then you tell them they can take it from me. It's far easier to hide in a crowd than it is to hide in the wilderness. And that point is proven by the New York City Halloween parade. Werewolf.
Happy Halloween, everyone. I've been saving this extra scary story for this special episode tonight. So dim your lights, pull your covers up, and get ready for the terrifying saga that we like to call
Halloween Werewolf Story. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this is a story my mother used to tell me when I was a boy and I wouldn't behave. She told me that bad kids get punished by werewolves. My mother told me that when she was a young adult, she was still living with her parents. She didn't move out until she married my dad, but that's another story. I don't even know if she knew him yet at this point. Mom got invited to a wild Halloween party, and her mother absolutely forbid her to go. Her mom wanted her to attend a boring party closer to home with less exciting people at it. Her mom had agreed to lend her the car for the evening, but only if she went to the boring party. Mom agreed, but she never intended to attend that one. She knew where she wanted to spend Halloween evening, and so, of course, she drove in the dark on a long, lonely highway leading to the more exciting party. And that's where Mom's car blew a tire. She had to pull over and change the tire while in her costume. One time when she told me the story, she was dressed as Catwoman from the Batman TV show, and another time she insisted she was a little Bo Peep. It seems you'd remember the difference, but anyway, she either had to change the tire as a little Bo Peep or a TV version of Catwoman, depending on what night you caught my mom telling this story. She said she was hoping someone would feel sorry for her and help her, but, like I mentioned earlier, it was a lonely stretch of highway that night. Maybe everyone else was going to the boring party, I don't know. As Mom got the tire off the car, she said she heard a strange sound in the woods past the car. She said she didn't look to see what it was at first. She just worked harder and faster on her tire. Mom was hoping to get out of there fast enough that it wouldn't matter who or what was emerging from the bushes on the other side of her vehicle. She tried to block out what she was hearing, but eventually she could hear and sense that whatever it was approaching her. She had to see what was going on. Mom told me she figured she had two options. Either she could do a sneaky peek over the car to see what she could see, or she could just stand up like a human and face whomever or whatever that was. She was impatient and opted for the latter. Standing up, she looked past the car and there it was. A werewolf, as tall as a man. I asked her to define werewolf in this context, and she surprisingly did not describe a Lon Chaney sort of guy with a furry face and a full suit of clothing. She described something more like what we would call a dogman these days. It was essentially a standing wolf or an upright wolf. The front paws were large, but they were not hands. The back legs were bent like a wolf's legs, but the creature stood bipedally on them. It held its paws, claws on them prominently displayed, out in front of itself in a position she took as threatening. Mom hadn't finished putting the second tire on the car. She got in the driver's seat with a thud, and the car fell off the jack. Turning the key, she started the process of revving up that engine. It would never start on the first try, but it would always start eventually. The dogman seemed confused by her behavior and all the activity, but only momentarily, as he regrouped to walk over to her passenger side window. Mom said the engine started just as that thing pressed its ugly dog face up against the side view window and got its doggy saliva everywhere. These days, you could get on TV with this story and get that window analyzed for DNA, but back then, Mom was only concerned about how she was going to clean it off before her mother saw it. Driving away, the dogman kept pace on her passenger side, staring in the window. She said it looked almost like a pig-nosed dog. I asked if she meant a pug, and she said, yeah, like it had a pig nose, but a dark one. When I quizzed her about the rest of the monster's appearance, she said it was brown. She didn't remember much more than it being hairy and brown. When I asked if its ears were pointed or floppy, she said that when it ran, they sometimes seemed pointed and sometimes floppy. I asked her if its eyes glowed, and she seemed a little surprised by that question. So the finish of the story is just a tale of horsepower versus dog power. The car eventually moved too fast for the dogman to keep up. And then the back tire fell off. At this point, Mom was about 3/4 of a mile from a gas station, and so she drove on what was left until she got there and phoned her mom. She had to admit the truth about which party she was heading to. She had no choice. She got punished for it, but Mom knew that the real punishment that night was meted out by the dogman. So I went through a few stages with this story. I believed it as a kid with all my heart. It was gospel to me back then. But as I became a tween, I grew suspicious of nearly everything that adults said. As a teenager and in college, though, I had become interested in stories about the dogman and modern werewolves. At that point, I started looking at these old stories in a new way. Were they just cautionary tales? Did Mom make the stories up to get me to behave? Was the werewolf in the story just a boogeyman to scare me straight, as it were? Or had Mom really seen something that looked like it had a dog head that night? I brought the subject up with her 4 different times in her later years, and it was really hard for me to tell exactly what her responses meant. She basically told the stories in the same way, just leaving off the part at the end about how she deserved the werewolf, and if I misbehaved, he'll come to get me in trouble too. Or worse. I tried to get her to discuss it from other angles. In what way was she scared of the creature? Did she think it wanted to harm her? Did she feel in fear for her life? She would always say that she was worried what her mother would say. Maybe that was just the truth. Maybe she was still just kind of young and really was more concerned about getting in trouble with her mom than getting eaten for a lunch by a dogman. It didn't bring me any closer to really feeling whether this was a recounting of an actual event or just a story told so many times over that it almost seems like a real story when you repeat it one more time. The fact that there were no other surviving witnesses didn't help things. Both of my mom's parents had passed on long ago, so I couldn't ask them if the flat tire part of the story was true, or the dogman slobber on the window part either. And it wasn't like Mom would insist to me that it was real, or that it was a legend. Any kind of question I made about it just set off the old record player playing the story of the werewolf that slobbered on my mom's car window one more time. And what did that mean as an answer? I'm still not very sure. But that's my mom's story of the Halloween werewolf.
I strongly suggest you get comfortable, dim the lights, and get your popcorn ready. This is the one we call.
I saw Dogman swimming underwater. Dear Scary Stories NYC, where I grew up in the country in Pennsylvania, our property was defined on one side by a slow-moving tiny river or maybe a large stream. We would jump off trees into the water, we'd swim in it, and we'd explore underwater caves, some of which led to tunnels which had air in them as well as water. One time, when I dove in the river, I opened my eyes near the bottom of the stream and witnessed what looked to me like a huge dog swimming into a small cave opening under the water. This 2 or 3 second long sighting would completely change my life because I was the kid who could honestly say, I saw Dogman swimming underwater. I got out of that water and went straight home to talk to my older brother about it. He was 7 years older than I was, and he had told me about some of his own Dogman sightings. He asked me to take him back to where I saw it, but it was starting to get dark, so I said I'd take him there in the morning. The next day was Saturday, so we planned on spending the entire day swimming that little river and trying to swim into the same cave or tunnel that I had seen the Dogman go into. I asked my brother what we would do if we went in there and found the Dogman asleep. Or worse yet, what if we found him awake? My brother said something along the lines of, well, in that case, we better get out of there fast. That was the entirety of his plan. Yet, I looked up to him as though he were a god. Such is the life of the older brother, or at least that's how boys were back in the 20th century. I dove off the tree in the same spot as I had the evening before, and swam over to the opening in the side wall of the river that I had seen the Dogman swim into. It just looked dark, and I wasn't as sure this would be a good idea as I had been the night earlier. My brother didn't care, though. He swam right in. I had to go up to the surface for air 4 times, and my brother still hadn't come out. I was getting scared that he was stuck in there and drowning. I really wasn't sure what to do, and I felt myself begin to panic. Then, out he came, nonchalantly. Back up at the surface, he said there was a cave in there, with air that was fresh, with ventilation somewhere off in the darkness past where he could see. He told me he looked around a little and found evidence that some kind of predator had in fact been spending time there, although he spared me the details since I was young and impressionable. He told me I'd better keep out of that cave and probably stop swimming alone there as well. I had already decided that myself, so I didn't mind what he was saying. I didn't think he should swim there alone either. the river was swarming with the Dogman. And I know because I saw Dogman swimming underwater. Get comfortable and lower the lights. I'm gonna tell you a story about a person who was crazy about Dogman. All he wanted to hear about was Dogman. That's why when others saw him coming, they would say, Dogman, Dogman, Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story about my youth that involves Dogman. Actually, most stories from my youth involve Dogman since I was a huge fan of the monster back then. But this story involves me actually seeing him and the repercussions of that sighting. Repercussions not for me, but for the others who didn't think that werewolves were real. Back then, I lived with my parents and my older brother, who I'll call Jared. He and I were best friends until we moved to that house, and he took up with some creepy older kids. All of a sudden, we weren't allowed to be best friends anymore because his new friends didn't like kids my age. It really stunk and was a very hard time for me. I hated that house, I hated my life, and I wasn't making any friends at my new school. The social competition felt stupid, and I refused to participate. My brother was the opposite, willing to sell me out to be popular. I had no desire to be popular because none of those kids seemed very nice to me. I didn't even really want to know them, let alone get them to like me. My attitude was that if people in that town disliked you, that meant you were onto something and you should probably keep on doing that. It's sort of my philosophy still, and it's what I plan on telling my own son when he's old enough to find out that other kids are horrible. Back then, I loved Dogman, and it was a hard time to love Dogman, I'll tell you. Not like today. There would be an occasional article and book, so I read them all, but there were slim pickings in between. I would go to werewolf movies, but I was mainly interested in Dogman, not men who changed into something resembling Dogman. But hey, they did resemble Dogman, so I saw every werewolf movie there was. I knew the black and white ones. I knew the Spanish ones. I knew the made-for-TV ones. I knew the celebrity ones. I even watched Stargate because I thought of Anubis as a Dogman. Jared used to love all the same stuff as me, but all of a sudden, he was calling Dogman kid stuff and making fun of me for being interested in cryptids. Like I said, it was not the best time in my life. So one night that autumn, it was cold out and my mother got Jared a scarf to wear when he went out to hang with his awful new friends. Jared was afraid of getting made fun of for wearing the scarf, so he left it home. My mother told me to go after him and bring the scarf. I really didn't want to because I knew what would happen. He and his creepy friends would call me names and pick on me, and he wouldn't take the stupid scarf anyway. Then, later on or the next day, he'd give me hell for embarrassing him in front of his friends. I tried to tell this to my mother in a way she might understand, but she sent me out to bring him the scarf anyway. There I was, out in the dark and cold in front of our suburban house in Pennsylvania, holding a stupid scarf that nobody wanted, charged with a fool's errand I didn't feel I should be on. It put me in a bad mood, but I decided to do what I had been asked to do anyway. My brother and his idiot cohorts would hang out by the side of the church in our town at night. They weren't religious or anything, obviously. They just knew a place hidden in shadow by the front of the church on that block. The building next door was abandoned during that period, so it afforded them the cover of darkness. I had no idea at that age why teenagers were so interested in the cover of darkness, but I can hazard a few guesses when I'm looking back on that time. At any rate, I knew a shortcut through the woods that led to the back of the church. My plan was to go that route, sneak up on the jerks, maybe even give them a little scare. Then I'd tell Jared his mommy ordered him to wear the scarf. I toss it in his direction, flip them all off, and walk home through my shortcut. I was playing it in my head over and over. I was going to be such a badass. I was even starting to look forward to the confrontation. This wasn't my idea, and I would make that clear. I didn't like those people, and I would make that clear as well. I would do my duty asked from me by my mother. I would immunize myself from being blamed for the incident afterward, and I would go home and look for Dogman and other scary stories online until bedtime. Well, things don't always go the way we plan them. I entered the patch of woods that was my shortcut to the back of the church. It was way darker at night, and I should have anticipated that, but I was a kid. I thought about going back home for a flashlight, but then I would have to explain to my mother what my intentions were, and now that I had seen that dark forest at night, I didn't think she would agree that I should take that shortcut. She might even insist on driving me to my brother, which would just escalate the situation beyond control. If I were forced to reveal their creepy hiding spot to my mom, every one of them would have it in for me as long as I lived there. No, I was going to have to let my eyes adjust to the darkness, and I was going to have to navigate this natural area and find my target, same as if it were a well-lit path. I was going to have to be brave and just execute my duty. And so, when my eyes could see a little better, I set off carefully through those woods toward my destination. I was watching where I was going since I knew there were a lot of rocky outcroppings in there, and they were partially hidden by the fall leaves covering everything. It was also sometimes easy to slip on leaves laying on top of wet rocks. I learned from experience how treacherous it can be in there during the day, so I took it slow while progressing forward at night. I had no fear up to this point, other than this gnawing unhappiness about what mean thing my brother and his friends would say to me this time. I felt comfortable in those dark woods since I had walked them 4 or 5 times already, and I had never seen anything living in there except squirrels. I wasn't a kid that scared easily. Like I said, I was a Dogman fan. I used to say all the time that I wished I could see a Dogman in real life. And then, right there, I heard a twig crack. I looked, and there was a Dogman standing right there. It was not facing me, it was facing away. And then I gasped, blowing my cover entirely. It was then that I learned an important life lesson. If you wish to be able to see a dangerous predator in real life, you are also wishing for said predator to get a good long look at you. And that's what this Dogman did. It turned and it stared right at me. I will attempt to describe this monster, which I think I saw for a total of 7 or 8 seconds, in as much detail as I can squeeze out of my memory. Then I will resume the narrative. Okay, here goes. It's hard to describe what I saw because, seeing it, I was gripped by a fear that was not like any I had ever experienced before. I was almost in a car accident 2 years ago, and we nearly went over a cliff. Even during all that, I did not feel the intensity of fear I felt when that Dogman turned and made eye contact with me. I don't think it was just a kid fearing for his life. There is an extra fear that you have when you see one of those things, and I can only guess about why. Why was the Dogman so much more frightening than any other truly life-threatening situation? What other threat does Dogman pose that we somehow deep inside recognize and are so terrified by? Can the Dogman take something more from you than your life? Is Dogman really as unholy as it seems? And can it actually damage or even steal your soul itself? Since I don't even know what I mean when I say soul, I'm obviously engaging in speculation. It's just a guess, but it wasn't just the unexpected nature of the beast and the existential threat it presented that caused me to be so afraid. There's something about Dogman that is just worse even than the idea of everything ending. I'm not equipped to explain it better than that, but I know enough to know that nothing is more frightening than a Dogman, and there must be a reason for that. It's possible the reason itself would be terrifying, so maybe I don't really want to find out. You might think it's strange that I begin the physical description of the animal with an explanation of how terrifying it was, but the fear that the creature set off around it was like an actual material thing you could reach out and touch. I had read about the Dogman having glowing eyes, but I hadn't expected them to look the way they did. This was not a steady glow like a cat's eyes in the darkness. This was more like a hypnotic, flickering candle. This was something hard to tear your gaze away from. It felt like it was able to trap you by your eyes and lure you in, that you were a fish caught on the end of its line. The beast was tall, but I don't really know how tall. Taller than my dad. It was big, but not a linebacker like the way people describe Dogman these days. This was a big, but relatively thin monster. It was a large dog upright on its hind legs, but not Arnold Schwarzenegger. It held its paws, in front of it in a begging posture, just as I had read about back then in Linda Godfrey's material. It had a wolf-like head, but taller ears, almost as long as a hare's ears. I don't really know what its legs looked like, but they must have appeared like dog legs because the top was so dog-like. The main difference between it and a regular dog was its posture, but this was a being with an intelligence far beyond your average Fido. Personally, I feel like I met an alien that night. I don't know if it was from another planet, another dimension, a cave system under the planet or what, but it was an out-of-place creature. It wasn't like a bear or a deer. It was some other kind of thing. Sometimes I wonder if it might have been a superior intelligence. Maybe it knew how to pilot a spacecraft, but most of the time I just think it was some kind of semi-enchanted entity and that it might have been as intelligent or more intelligent than I was as a kid. In other words, some kind of super dog that got to our reality by mistake. Seeing as how there are still, to this day, so many reported sightings of Dogman in Pennsylvania where this took place, I would say that for this theory to hold any water, there must be an awful lot of these creatures accidentally getting here. At what point do anomalous creatures stop being anomalous and start taking over? What exactly would the tipping point be? I've told you all I can remember about what I saw, and I told you all my theories about it. Now, back to what happened next. I ran. I ran toward where I expected my brother to be. I heard the monster behind me, and I started weeping. How funny it would be, I thought, if I actually got eaten by a Dogman. That would be like if one of the jock kids who worshipped Derek Jeter got eaten by him. It was just stupid. It wasn't how I wanted to go. I remember feeling such pain in my side that I couldn't run any further. And I remember running on anyway, no matter how badly it hurt. When I got to the back of the church, I couldn't hear the Dogman behind me any longer. Make of that what you will. I staggered to the front of the church and found my brother and his friends, then leaned back against the church wall and slid to the floor, panting for air, my cheeks covered in tears. "Well, what have we got here?" I heard one of them say, and I tossed the stupid scarf in their direction. It landed on the dirt. In between panting, I got out a few words. "Your mommy says, 'Wear your scarf, Jariwari.'" I got out. It felt good. I didn't even care what they did to me in return. But what they did in return was make fun of Jared, not me. "Put on your scarfy warfy Jariwari," and so forth. I was too tired to even care. In my head, I was plotting out my course home. I was gonna take the long and well-lit route, but I needed to regain the ability to stand before I could recommence walking. My brother came over and gave me a weird look. "Why are you so out of breath? Are you okay?" he asked. And for a moment, I was stupid enough to think he actually cared about me. I foolishly told him the truth, that I had been chased out of the woods by the Dogman. Oh boy, you should have heard the jeering and the laughter. I just got up my strength and stood up, bracing myself for the long route home. As I was walking away, I heard them talking about going into the woods to see the Dogman for themselves. I stopped and turned to them seriously, trying to let them know I wasn't joking around. I told them not to go in there, that it wasn't safe. They made fun of me. I told Jared specifically that it really wasn't safe and that I wasn't messing around. I asked him to please not go in there. They just kept making fun of me, and I left. I figured they didn't have the nerve to find out for themselves. They were out of my mind before I was 2 blocks toward home. No way they had the courage to do what I did. I went home and went to bed, and as far as I was concerned, that was that. At 3 a.m. or so, my brother was in my room shaking me awake quietly. He told me to get up. I turned on the light next to my bed and I saw my brother was all messed up. His clothes were torn and he was crying. He said they had gone into the forest and the Dogman chased them. He was trapped in there for hours and lost track of his friends. I never saw him weeping like that before or since. I kept thinking, this had to be a trick. He was just making fun of me, and I kept saying that to him. He showed me that his jacket was torn. His jacket that he had spent a bundle of his own money to buy. Would he have done that just as a joke? No, he wouldn't, but sometimes things get torn by accident, and maybe this was one of those times. The other guys did turn up eventually. They were all right, but they never made fun of me about the Dogman ever again, I'll tell you that much. And my brother stopped hanging with them as much after that. They stayed friends, just not in that creepy way they had before. My brother grew up a lot after seeing the Dogman. He got a job and, to be honest, became kind of boring. But he wasn't mean anymore, and we went back to being friends. It was never the same as when we were kids. We were never best friends again, but we loved each other and we weren't afraid to show it. He passed on suddenly last year, and I've been thinking about nothing but him and the Dogman ever since. Maybe he wouldn't have straightened his life out if he had believed me about the Dogman. Maybe he really needed to go in there and have the shock of his life to wake him up. But it will always hurt that my own brother didn't believe in my Dogman sighting just because I was always going around talking about Dogman, Dogman, Dogman. That was pretty scary, but I think I have one to top it. This is a story sent in by a former farmer. He says his family was driven off their land because Dogman is savage and evil. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I like a lot of your stories, but I have to say I also strongly dislike some of them as well. The ones I don't like are the Dogman has a pet cat type stories, where people try to humanize Dogman or make him seem like he's the family pet. Either those stories are not true, or else they're stories of an entirely different species than the kind my family had to deal with on our farm when I was young. In fact, Dogman is the main reason our family lost that farm, at least in my opinion, and I hold a distaste for the creature bordering on hatred itself. If evil could be represented by a living thing, it would be the Dogman. And if evil is actually only a personal perception, then Dogman can be said to be the enemy of humanity, because he has no redeeming qualities, and he has no good intentions for us good people. I see writers online expressing curiosity about the Dogman, saying they would like to see one and so on. Being curious about Dogman is like being curious about jumping off a bridge. Watch a film about it, don't try to witness it in person. Don't become a part of Dogman's life, because then he might be the ruination or end of yours. Those of you who think I'm just writing a smear piece about your favorite teddy bear monster should probably skip ahead to the next story, because Dogman isn't going to do anything cute in this one. This is the story of how Dogman ruined my family's life. It started with our chicken coop getting raided. We thought it was a pack of dogs. There were all the signs of it, which I won't detail here. I know you can't talk about certain subjects, so I will just say that it was quite a mess and cost the family some change to replace the lost birds and fix the coop itself. We rebuilt it to keep dogs out using stronger fencing material and locking it with a combination lock. It wasn't but another week before that coop got raided again, this time with the lock being torn right off the gate. What I mean is, the lock remained locked, but what it was locking up got broken and whatever it was entered. Now, no dog or pack of dogs is going to do something like that. One of our neighbors said it was Chupacabra, and our other neighbor on the other side told us that Bigfoot had robbed their chicken coop 20 years prior. We asked what they did about it, and they said nothing, it just never came back. They told us we probably wouldn't hear from that old Bigfoot for another 20 years, but we couldn't afford to spend any more money protecting our birds. I decided to camp out by the coop so I could personally protect them. I figured if nothing showed up for another couple of weeks, I could return to my usual bed, chalking it up to Bigfoot, as our neighbor suggested. That very first night, I found out what had been causing the trouble, and it sure as heck wasn't Bigfoot. Sometime during that night, the chickens went crazy, flapping their wings, running around and squawking. I rose as fast as I could and looked at the gate, but I didn't believe what I saw. There, standing at the lock and trying to pull it off the door, was a large, hairy creature, all right, but it didn't have a conical monkey head. This big man had a dog head, so we were right about it being a dog, but we were wrong at the same time. This was a man-sized dog, standing on its hind legs. Its paws were hand-like, but I don't want to say they were hands exactly. It was able to grab around and hold that lock, but it was pushing down on it from above, not exactly the way a man would do it if he had that thing's strength. It looked like a black German Shepherd type dog, but it did not pant, and its tongue wasn't hanging out. It just gritted its bared teeth while exerting itself, and its eyes had a look of fierce presence to them, more like a Zen monk than a wild animal. I fired over its head, and the noise caused it to bolt, just like any other animal. It hadn't expected me to be there, and the element of surprise worked in my favor that night. I doubted it would a second time, though. One of our neighbors the next day listened to my story and told me that the Dogman doesn't exist. I got insulted and took offense, He laughed and assured me that I had seen what I had seen, and he knew that. But the Dogman wasn't real, and that was how to deal with him. Confused, I asked him to explain, and the theory went something like this. Since Dogman doesn't exist, you can't take pictures of him. Therefore, if you set up motion-activated cameras around the chicken coop, then the Dogman won't be able to visit it, since the cameras would get set off and take a picture of him. And we all know pictures can't be taken of the Dogman because the Dogman doesn't exist. Simple. We installed motion-activated cameras around the chicken coop, which were very primitive compared to what you can get today. The coop was never bothered by Dogman again. But that just got the thing angry, and it started doing things to bother us. It would wait till we were asleep, then tap on our bedroom window at night to wake us up. Imagine waking up to a Dogman baring his teeth at you through the window. Try to get back to sleep after that. We managed to last about a year at the location once that Dogman started haunting us. I tell you, it's not a natural creature. It's some kind of spirit, but it still needs to eat. That makes it the nastiest kind of spirit you could ever have haunting you. It'll make you wish you had a poltergeist instead. I won't even try to list all the animals we lost to that horrible thing before we gave up and had to sell the farm at a huge loss. It ended our ability to be farmers, and so we all work in offices and at Walmart now. It ruined 5 generations of family tradition in 1 year when it moved into our area. And I personally think it was sent by the devil himself. If you want to see Dogman in person, that's your own business. But if you think he's some kind of cuddly cute monster that you can be a fan of, then I'm here to tell you that Dogman is savage and evil. I got the doggy goose pimples from that story, but I'll be back with an even scarier one right after this.
We're going to have a special longer episode on the 30th.
That's right, Nancy.
That's the night before Halloween.
And to celebrate, we're putting on the Night Before Halloween special. And we'll all have our own extra scary stories we've been saving up for that scariest of holidays.
Wednesday, October 30th.
We'll all be there. Hope you are too.
It's the Night Before Halloween special, an extra long Dogman Scary Stories extravaganza right here on the Scary Stories NYC channel. The Svengali Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story to tell you about the Dogman, but it's not your average Dogman story. This is a story about a Dogman that messed with my head. This is the story of the Svengali Dogman. I was living alone in Palo Alto about 8 years ago, fairly close to the water. I was renting this house while I freelanced a job, and I was considering moving there from the East Coast, where I am originally from. Now, Palo Alto is obviously a very large human settlement in a string of highly populated areas all along both sides of the San Francisco Bay. Now, while that is true, Palo Alto is sandwiched between wild areas, with shoreline preserves on one side and around a dozen natural areas on the other. It's even zoned to include Los Trancos Woods and the Montebello Preserve, with a long, thin stretch of land connecting the two. For these and other reasons, we hip urban intellectuals in Palo Alto can sometimes see strange creatures from time and space at our wilder edges. And I got to see the strangest creature of all, the Dogman. Sometimes I think that life is like a video game. Sometimes we have control over our destiny, and other parts of our lives are just like cutscenes. They're pretty much going to happen one way and one way only. We're going to play our part in fate whether we like it or not. It feels like a mixture of destiny and individuality. For instance, just because one might be born with great destiny doesn't mean one still can't manage to screw everything up and ruin the future for everybody. Still, I prefer the game scenes in life to the cut scenes. Even though I know I might mess everything up, I love free will, and I love to exercise it. So, one day I decided, or I thought I was the one making the decision, to take a walk out by the water. They have these pathways of dirt they've built up in the middle of the sloughs so you can observe nature. The sloughs, by the way, are basically mud that's too wet to walk through. Sometimes they even go underwater and become shallow pools, unusable land, at least to us humans. I remember walking on a dirt pathway, and on one side was mud, just a huge field of mud with moss and small green things growing from it. On the other side, it looked like a small lake. Over the pathway, high tension wires were strung, and on the side with the water, electrical towers were built right into that water to hold the wires taut. I stared at all of this in as much wonder as I regarded the nature, and down to my right, there appeared to be a sort of bridge over those waters. It's attached to the high tension towers, and I imagine they must be there for the workers to access the towers when need be. Now, down on that thin bridge stood a man. An instinct told me before my eyes that he was looking at me. I turned and observed, and there was the tallest humanoid I had ever seen. I say humanoid instead of man, because this being appeared dog-headed to me. I was instantly aware that what I was seeing was not normal vision. It's possible that because of the proximity of the high-tension wires that I was having some sort of vision. Whether any of this was real or imaginary is beyond my ability to explain or even understand. I'll just try to relate the facts, and maybe you can make more sense out of it than I could. So, this Anubis stood there, and he took me into his eyes and explained the entire universe to me. It was one aha moment after another. All of the greatest mysteries of all time were revealed, and they all seemed so obvious to me at the moment. I didn't understand how I had not always seen these things, as they were just so obvious. The one who revealed things to me informed me that I would not remember most of this, although it would be good practice for me to begin to try anyway. I replied that I would try to remember what he just said, and I have. But all of the other revelations and wisdom were lost in the amnesia of waking human reality. The Anubis Dogman showed me everything, then answered my further questions, and then, after I knew everything, we disregarded all those facts and joined with the conscious oneness and experienced the most remarkable bliss. This was the bliss out of which everything springs and continues to spring and spring. It felt like a very long time had passed, and I forgot I was human, until suddenly I was again, and I was staring into the glowing eyes of that black, humanoid Dogman. He left me with one final command. I was to abandon my life and go live as a survivalist by the Black Mountain. I went home and started packing. My boss called on my freelance job and asked if I was going to make my deadline. I realized I couldn't go live on a mountain. I had responsibilities to satisfy before I could do anything. Somehow the Dogman had overwritten all my internal hardware's previous commands, at least until my fail-safes started to kick in, and there's no better failsafe than an employer nervous about a deadline. I had a girlfriend I'd been seeing for a couple of weeks that was amazing physically, but we rarely had very deep conversations. I hadn't been out there very long though, and she was the main friend I had. Since she was into outdoor activities, I asked her if she would want to go camping with me by the Black Mountain in the previously mentioned Montebello Preserve. I don't even think they allow camping, but they allow hiking, and we brought compact camping equipment with us in our backpacks. In my mind, I was not doing what the Dogman told me. As far as I was concerned, I was resisting him and asserting my own desires above his commands. He wanted me to drop everything and live in the woods. I, on the other hand, reached a stopping point on the work I had to do and took my girlfriend away for a weekend of camping. After all, I was curious. Why Black Mountain? What could be there that a vision of Anubis would tell me to live there when I stood under the high-powered lines? I wanted to find out, then just go home like normal. I just wanted to satisfy my curiosity. I was still the master of my own destiny, and I was the one calling the shots. That night, I heard a noise outside the tent that made me nervous. It was something big. Maybe a man. Maybe a bear. I didn't know, but I knew it was large by the sounds of its breathing and footfall. I didn't want to wake up my girlfriend. Let's call her Shara. But I didn't want to actually go out there either. My plan was to go there for this kind of thing specifically, to see what might happen to me that might not happen to someone else, to find out if there really was some importance to this area for me personally, whatever that meant. To try to understand the Anubis vision is, I guess, what I mean. Well, are you going to look out there or do I have to? Shara asked me. I hadn't realized she was awake, but she asked me how she was supposed to sleep with whatever that was stomping around out there. So, even though she was the far more experienced outdoors person, I was the larger of the two of us, and it was time for me to man up a bit. I nervously unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, not wanting to draw any attention to myself that I didn't need to. Cautiously, trembling, I peered through the opening. An annoyed sigh and a quick nudge from Shara pushed me out a little faster than I had planned on sticking my head out, but it got the job done. I found myself gazing out at a night filled with the brightest stars I'd ever seen in my life. It was like the planetarium out there that night. And then I noticed the presence. According to Shara, what happened then was I calmly walked out of the tent and left. She says I walked to the woods while she called for me, and that there was nobody out there except me. She considered coming after me, but for some reason felt it would be better to return to sleep, so she did. The way I remember it was that I was greeted by Anubis, and he congratulated me for following my orders to the letter. I was informed that my entire life had been leading up to that moment. I was taken to the forest, which appeared like a cathedral in my new vision. There were many spirits there, and I wasn't sure if they were real or ghosts, but they all had a consciousness and a presence to them. There were dogmen and rodent men, and snake men and bird men. They were at once terrifying and alarming, and transcendent. The only thing I can think to compare them with would be ancient Indian depictions of deities and demons. Wise, yet savage all at once. Forces of nature, unapologetic and powerful. I was told that it was my destiny to follow their ways, that my days working on software were over, my days as a philosopher done. I had never consciously regarded myself as a philosopher before they described me that way. They said the word dismissively, as though the heights of human mentation were beneath the ways of savagery and feral nature. I rejected this, and they told me it was not my place to do so. I don't remember the rest of the conversation, but I do remember that Shara and I drove back home the next day. I must have said something to offend the spirits of the woods, or else their telling me what my place was may have offended me. I resented them trying to fit me into a pre-planned destiny where I had no say and would be forced to behave like someone I did not feel myself to be. My career, which had been taking off, sort of leveled out and began reversing. I've worked a job in an office for years now. I actually earn less than when I started because they made me an executive, and now I don't get paid for all my overtime. I still get bossed around all day, since the executive in my title is just an excuse to get me to work cheaper, and not an actual promotion of any sort. Still, my wife loves to brag that her husband is an executive, and she is very proud of my job. I earn enough to support us both, and she is free to volunteer at the dog shelter and the veterinarian. My wife has 4 dogs who I support as well. She calls them our family, but I won't even look them in the eye. I'm weird about that to this day. There's something about looking in a dog's eye that unnerves me. I just don't want to do it. I'm as kind as I can be to them. I pet them, and I get them dog biscuits, and I take them for walks. But I feel no connection inside toward them. And I know it all goes back to the terrifying days when I was younger and I came face to face with the Svengali. Dogman. Don't go anywhere, we've got one more scary story, and this is the best one in the episode, right after this.
Come see those American girls perform semi-live in hologram form on stage at the next Northeast Comic-Con. Meet Batman villains from the Gotham TV show. Watch Will Brierly's artificially intelligent cartoon character interview celebrities. See Debbie, Sophie, Alicia, and Chibi perform on stage. All this plus so much more.
Breaking news just added to the show are these stars. Dana DeLorenzo, star of Ash vs. the Evil Dead, the greatest horror comedy series that will ever be. Shake the hand that ended the second lives of so many Deadites. Also, Marty Ross of the New Monkees, Denny Lane from Wings and the Moody Blues, co-writer of Mull of Kintyre. He will actually come hang out with us mortals.
Hosted by the king of pop culture himself, Gary Summers. That's the last weekend of November 2019 in Boxborough, Massachusetts, home of the Wolf People.
Well, the one good thing about going last is you get to go last. And we've saved the best story for last in this episode, as you are about to see and hear. And the title of this little mini classic is Dogman and the Black-Eyed Hotties. Dear Scary Stories NYC, you recently ran a story about someone being bothered by the black-eyed kids and then seeing Dogman. Amazingly, there is a story my friend told me that is weirdly similar to that one. Only in my friend's story, the black-eyed kids were a bit older, and they were sexy females. And yes, this all immediately preceded a Dogman sighting. Well, a Dogman experience, I should say, as it was a bit more than a sighting. I'll tell you about all of it, but you better get comfortable, 'cause it takes a bit of telling. This was the mid-1960s. I believe it was 1966 in Pennsylvania. That's years before the Black-Eyed Kids ever appeared, and my friend had never heard of them when I mentioned them. And these were not your average boys in hoodies. The story begins with my friend's dad at Freeport Beach in Pennsylvania on Lake Erie. This was when his father was around 20, I think. He was at the beach alone, taking in some rays and getting in a swim in the afternoon on a Wednesday because he worked the night shift. Most other people were at work, and even though it was a warm and perfect beach day, there weren't very many other people there. Everyone had plenty of space for themselves, in other words. For this reason, he was surprised when two attractive young women, wearing big sunglasses and matching bathing suits, came over and asked him if they could lie on his beach towel. My friend's dad said he sat right up at attention and wanted to accommodate the young ladies. He had no girlfriend, and these two were a step above the kind of girls he had been dating, at least in a superficial appearance kind of a way. That having been said, when he looked in their faces, those large, reflective sunglasses showed him his own face looking at them, and something about the entire situation felt weirdly sinister. It was one of those too good to be true scenarios, and he felt as though this must be a trap. My friend's dad said he looked around the beach to see if he recognized anybody. He thought maybe one of the jocks from his old school were playing a gag on him or something like that, and had put these two girls up to come play a trick on him. But as I said, there weren't many people there, and the few that he could see were total strangers. My friend's dad felt a very strong physical attraction to the young women. Heck, he felt a strong attraction to most young women in those days. He was young himself. "Come on, mister," said the redhead. "Invite us to sit on your towel with you." "Yeah," said the blonde. "We can't very well sit with you if you don't invite us, can we?" Fear shot through my friend's father's heart. No, he was not new at dating. It wasn't that sort of thing. He wasn't usually shy around women either. But something about this situation had alarm bells going off inside of him. He looked at his watch and told him he was going to have to leave for work soon. "We need someone to rub lotion on us," cooed the blonde one. If my friend's dad was standing, his knees would have been weak, but he was sitting, and his will was strong. He pointed out that his towel was not very large, and barely was wide enough for him to sit on. "We don't have any towel to lie on, mister," the redhead resumed. She leaned down to get closer to him. It was clear she was losing her temper. "You have one towel, and we have 0. Why can't you ask us to share?" As she leaned down on that hot day, her sunglasses momentarily slid down to the end of her nose. She almost immediately pushed them back up with her index finger, but in that brief moment, what my friend's dad saw would be enough to send most people from 1966 into the psych ward in a straitjacket. What he saw when her eyes were uncovered for just 1 second was that she had completely black eyes, and they were a bit too large, too. I imagine that they did have black contact lenses back then, which would have been used in movies, but why would someone wear them over their eyes, then put sunglasses on over that? The only logical thing to think was that their eyes really looked like that. They really were all black. My friend's dad grabbed his stuff and backed away, telling them that they could have his towel, but he was splitting for work. They just watched him as he backed off. Then he turned and ran to the parking lot. He said that was the most frightened he had ever been, and it was a bright sunny day when he was talking to pretty women. How could he be frightened of pretty girls in the middle of a beautiful day at the beach? He turned around to see if the girls were following him, and he couldn't see them anywhere. My friend's father thought that this was the strangest thing that could ever happen to him. He was dead wrong. Driving back home, the day turned to dusk. It was a 3-hour drive home to a town called Dubois, which was near Bimini Beach on Bimini Lake. My friend's dad used to work there when he was a teenager, and he was still feuding with the management, so he would drive 3 hours each way just to not go to Bimini Beach. The roads he took cut right through the very heart of the Allegheny National Forest. As he hit those woods on the way home that evening, with the tall trees towering over him on either side, a summer thunderstorm suddenly erupted overhead. The rain started just pouring down in drops big enough to carry goldfish in them. The road conditions became slippery, and my friend's father slowed down his driving a bit. He figured it was a summer storm, and that the longest it would last would be 15 or 20 minutes. Well, maybe those rain clouds were heading in the same direction he was, because it just kept raining and raining. An hour later, and the storm he was driving through was just as bad as it had been when it started. The winds were blowing, and the trees were shaking on either side. It would have been intimidating to be driving through all that, and I know I would have considered doing what my friend's father did, which is that he pulled off the road to try and wait out the storm. The trees overhead were swaying back and forth so wickedly that he wondered if he might get crushed by one of them falling over. Maybe he would have been better off taking his chances driving. In a situation like that, it can be hard to know what would be the right thing to do. No matter what you choose, you have a percentage chance of being wrong, like a baseball manager. My friend's father tried to calm himself by thinking about it logically like that, but his emotions were not quieted by talk of percentage chances of survival. The inner child just wants to live, so the guy was freaking out a bit. The next thing he knew, his car was rocking up and down like something was pushing on his trunk really hard over and over. As he turned around and looked through the mirrors, he caught glimpses that eventually his mind put together as a hairy, Hulk-type monster messing with the trunk of his car. I remember my friend's dad's car from when we were kids. It was a 1964 red Plymouth with a white stripe down the side. It would have been only 2 years old when this story took place. I remember it in its final years before he had to eventually junk it. That was a shame. It was a classic car. And it was a car that had been literally messed with by Dogman. Because that's what was there. Because that's what that was. It was the Hulk. It was hairy. And it had a big old wet dog head filled with enough dinosaur-sized teeth to chew up the entire New York Philharmonic Orchestra. So, anyway, my friend's father started the car up and went to drive out of there, only the dirt had turned to mud and he was having a hard time gaining any traction. The Dogman grew furious at all of this and only banged harder on the trunk. That, in turn, allowed my friend's dad to get the car out of that wet quicksand like mud and get the car spinning sideways onto the highway. Once on the blacktop, he was able to maneuver forward until he was in a lane and speeding away. Before he could breathe a sigh of relief, he saw the Dogman running after him. Now, this was the biggest Dogman I've ever heard anyone claim to have seen. It was not 6 or 7 or 8 feet tall. It was the Hulk. It was 12 feet tall. As it ran on the highway, each step shook the road itself. As the earth shook under his car, my friend's father found the car itself bouncing on the wet road, and it became harder and harder to steer. Nevertheless, he hit the gas to speed up, because he could see that Dogman was actually gaining on him. He wasn't ashamed to tell his son that he was crying as he sped away, dangerously fast from the giant monster. He would never drive that fast in the rain, and he wasn't sure he would drive that fast when it wasn't raining. He wasn't sure if he could keep the vehicle on the road either. He was just going too fast. But if he slowed down, that would mean giving up his life to the Dogman. My friend's father almost drove off the road to the right. Then he almost drove into oncoming traffic on the left. It was nearly impossible to keep that car on the road as it bounced. When it wasn't skidding or sliding, my friend's father prayed that if he were allowed to survive this, he would go to church every Sunday for the rest of his life. He was desperate, and he was no longer expecting to survive this experience. Amazingly, he reached his turnoff and headed onto the local streets leading to his home. Although that rain continued to pour down like it was Noah Part 2, he didn't see the Dogman in his rearview mirror any longer. He hoped that the beast would be averse to entering a populated area, and he hoped that the worst of this was all over. He didn't sigh in relief, though, because he was still caught in a torrential downpour, and he still felt the very distinct presence of evil everywhere. What I mean to say is that after the black-eyed hotties and the world's largest Dogman in history, my friend's father was more than a little shaken up and more than a little paranoid. When you get hit with a 1-2 punch like that, you start to expect something even worse to happen. He drove home, parked, looked around to see if the coast was clear, then ran into his house as the rain continued to pour down like Niagara. My friend's father at that time still lived with his own parents, but his father was at work and his mother was out somewhere else. He called to them, but nobody was home. He set about drying himself off and tried to stop himself from shaking all over. Just as he had begun to calm down, a heavy thud caused his knees to buckle in fear. Something had hit hard into the side of the house. Something large. Turning and staring in the direction of the noise, he saw the last thing he wanted to see. Peering in the window was a dog head so oversized that he flashed on the image of King Kong peering in the window at Fay Ray. Obviously, this monster was no King Kong, but he may as well have been, because just seeing him made my friend's father lightheaded. He said he was seeing spots and was afraid he was going to black out as he ran, using his hands as much as his feet, upstairs to the bedroom with the telephone in it. He prayed that his parents had left it unlocked. They had, and he ran inside, collapsing to his knees in front of the phone, placing it on his lap, and leaning back against the bed. He forced himself to breathe deeply as he dialed 911, or whatever number you dialed to call the police back in those ancient times. He told them that there was a really big man trying to break into his house, and while he was speaking, there was a crash of glass from downstairs. He began crying and whispering to the police on the phone, crying because he didn't know if that monster was now inside, and whispering because if it was, he didn't want to be found. He thought about hiding in the closet, but that would mean having to hang up the phone. The cord didn't reach the closet, and there were no cell phones or those antenna receiver phones or any of that back then. He stayed on the line with the police dispatcher and listened to hear what was happening downstairs. Each time thunder hit, he would be unable to suppress a short scream. He was truly having a very bad day. Eventually, the woman on the phone told him that the police were there and about to ring his doorbell. They asked him if he would be able to let them in, or if they should take more drastic measures. He opted to be brave and go downstairs. If the Dogman was down there, he had been being quiet for some time. Maybe he had fallen asleep and changed back into Bill Bixby, I don't know. Walking down those steps must have taken a lot of courage, and my friend's father said he literally did it one step at a time. He would take a step, then he would wait to listen to see if anything else happened. When nothing moved or made a sound, he would take a second step down that staircase and wait again. He was in this process, in tune with his environment, listening for the slightest sound or movement inside that house. When, bam, bam, police, came from the front door. My friend's father said he lost his footing and bounced on his butt the rest of the way down those steps, then sprinted to the front door to let the cops in. Together, they found the window that had been broken. It was only smashed in a corner, not fully broken in. The Dogman had definitely not come into the house. Maybe it had only broken that window by accident. Maybe something else had caused the window to break, something that scared the Dogman off. The police searched the property and looked around the yards of the surrounding neighbors, but they said they didn't see anyone. There were probably large dog tracks everywhere in the mud, but since that wasn't what the police thought they were looking for, they would have been very unlikely to take notice of them. After all, they had been told to look for a very tall prowler, not a very tall werewolf. So, my friend's father was true to his word. He went to church that Sunday, and for as long as he was able to. Now he's in a home, but they have a pastor come and read from the Bible to him in bed on Sundays so that he can keep his promise that he made on that day that he thought the Dogman was going to end his story. According to my friend's father, the best prayer you can ever say is to just say thank you and mean it. Whenever my friend didn't want to go to church, his father would tell him that story again. His dad really felt that the only reason he never saw the Dogman or those black-eyed girls again was because he went to church every Sunday. He felt it was the only reason he was able to get married, the only reason he was able to father my friend. He felt that it was the first ingredient to his life, and he tried his best to instill that in his son, who never goes to church. And I mean never. He still calls himself a Christian, but I mean, he won't even go on Christmas and Easter, that guy. It's just not his thing. But the one takeaway he seems to have gotten from having this story told to him over and over during his most impressionable years is that he must always remain grateful. And that's the best kind of takeaway of all. Be grateful for what you have. If you have a lot, or if you have a little, at least you have something. And remember to appreciate every moment. Why? Because if you don't, you might get visited by Dogman and the black-eyed hotties, the UFOs in Dogman Swamp. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I grew up with my family on the edge of a swamp in a place I won't call by its real name. I will call it Dogman Swamp, but nobody ever actually called it that in real life, as far as I know. Dogman Swamp is, or was when we lived there, the most terrible place on the planet. It was a little bit of Hades on God's green earth, according to my mother. It even smelled like fire and brimstone almost every single day there. It was miserable living next to that swamp. It was alive, every square inch of it, and at the same time, it was some sort of tribute or shrine to death and misery. My sister told me that the dead rise from the swamps and walk. I have never seen this, but she told me that when I went away to summer camp one year, the dead rose from the water in the swamp and marched around the neighborhood, moaning for things that they had lost long, long ago. I asked where these dead people came from. How could they just rise out of the swamp? My parents told me there are many lost souls out in the swamp. Some are victims who got caught in the quicksand like nature, that it can sometimes adapt. Others might have been gotten by gators or those large snakes. Still, others met their fates at the hands of the human types of snakes, and were buried out there with concrete overshoes, at least figuratively. I had no idea about this aspect of the swamp. I just thought it was a nasty smelling waste area too goopy to make use of. But, as I was learning, it was in fact a living demon god that regularly accepted the highest form of sacrifice, the humankind. I had seen the Dogman since I was very young. In fact, I don't even remember the first time I saw them. They were just always there. I say they because I usually saw this duo of them, both gray all over, and the female had a lighter gray on her underside. It seemed they hunted together, unless they were scavenging, I'm not certain. I don't know if they would scavenge, but I could tell just by the look of them that they were built to hunt. Other members of my family saw single dogman or trios of them. They would call me over to look, and sometimes I would get to the window in time to see, but not always. We each had different dogmen that we would notice before the others. Nobody ever saw that male-female duo before I saw them. I can't explain that, but then again, I don't think I can adequately explain any of the phenomena I'm listing here. We all, in my family, saw enough of each other's dogmen and monsters and ghosts and so forth that we stopped doubting each other pretty early on. My father saw a little girl running around our house headless. She would scamper out of closets and run across his path, almost tripping him. It got to the point where he carried a yardstick or a baseball bat around the house with him. He would use it to lean forward slowly and open closet doors before he got too close to them. He said it wasn't really any less scary if she would run out when he was expecting her, but at least that way she didn't trip him up as she did so. I never saw that little girl, I am happy to say. I don't know what I would have done if I had to deal with that. I think that would scare me worse than the Dogman, or the night lights, or any of it. Since I mentioned the night lights, I'll go into them next. They were like flying amoebas in my opinion, but my sister and mother would call them orbs. They were usually changing shape as they floated through the air. I guess I could compare them to large soap bubbles, with other stuff going on inside them. The membrane or skin had to be thicker than a soap bubble because I never saw any of them pop, but they would really float along in a very similar way to the way large soap bubbles do when you blow on them. These bubbles or lights or lit-up floating amoebas were sometimes able to go very fast, as when they would decide to leave a scene quickly. That was never a good thing when they would do that, because it meant something was approaching that they did not want to be in the presence of. And if they didn't want to be in the presence of whatever it was, we learned quickly that we weren't going to like it any more than they did. So, what would make the nightlights fly away? The Dogman? Yes, definitely. The Poltergeist? Yes. The Invisible Man? Yes. We had all of these kinds of things going on around that swamp. I don't just mean out there in the wet and muck either. I mean in our house, out in front, on the street, I mean just anywhere in the area of the swamp, it was dangerous and terrifying. There was no safe space. I'll try to give you an example. This didn't happen to me, it happened to my sister. She told me she was out walking through the woods coming back from the library. It had been a bright sunny day before she entered them, but it got cold and foggy and misty as soon as she was too far into her walk to turn back. She started hearing the dogs howl, and she knew she had made a mistake. Behind her, she could hear something large was following. She couldn't see it through the fog, but she could hear it there. She guessed it was a dogman, then saw it emerge from the mist, glaring at her through bright reddish, orangish eyes. On her way home, my sister ran. She said hands rose out of the mud and tried to grab her feet as she ran past them, and each time she looked behind her, the dogman was there, always the exact same distance behind. He never came closer, but he never fell back either. He just seemed to be entertaining himself by making her run. She was nearing exhaustion, and yet she had no choice but to keep going. The dogman looked well rested as he grinned, his evil grin, back at her, forcing her to keep running, to avoid the hands in the mud trying to grab her, and to make it home before something got her. Except I was there when she got home that day, and as soon as she did, the inanimate objects in the kitchen became animated upon her entry. I mean, everything not nailed down. Things flew off shelves and narrowly missed her as she ran up to her room. Seconds later, I heard a blood-curdling scream from upstairs, and she ran back down, weeping hysterically. She said she saw her clothes walking around in her room as though someone were wearing them. But there was nobody there. This was not a good childhood, but we had nothing to compare it to, and our parents lectured us almost daily about how we had it so much easier than they did. They had the two of us racked with guilt for having such an easy life. My parents made it clear they resented us for how ungrateful and spoiled we were. I still don't really understand the meaning of either of those words, and I don't think either of them applied to me or her, but I grew up disliking myself and feeling I deserved to live like that because I had been told so many times about how easy I had it. One time, I heard a crying in the woods. I wasn't sure if it was one of the people my dad had told me get stuck in the swamp. Maybe I could save them, and there would be one less zombie to rise up out of the muck to scare my sister. I wandered into the smelly mess out there, careful that I didn't get myself stuck in that mud. And what do you think I saw? I saw a lady, but she was inside the bark of the trunk of a tree. She was crying, and tears were running down the trunk like sap. I asked her if she was okay, and she told me she had been swallowed up by the tree. She told me if I would grab her hand, maybe I could pull her back out. This was a bad idea. I was still young then, and I had the best of intentions, but even I knew this was a bad idea. Nevertheless, I didn't have a better one, so I grabbed the lady's wooden hand and she pulled me hard toward her. The benign expression on her face turned evil as she cackled like a witch from an old movie on the TV. She was shouting that I should join her and was trying to pull me inside the tree itself. I used my feet on its face to push myself away, shouting words that you can't say on your show. The entire time, it was laughing. This was such a funny thing as far as that messed up old tree was concerned. My sister says she has seen UFOs both rising up out of and settling back into the waters in the swamps. When we were younger, we had a theory that there was a space alien base under the water there. But she showed me the pond in question, and it's too small to be the entrance to an underground base. This must have been something more along the lines of a supernatural or paranormal vision than an actual alien spacecraft moving into water. For one thing, she told me the water would not splash or even ripple when the craft would enter into it or leave. She never heard it make a sound either. It did not look wet when it came out. It just seemed to be in water, then in air. And although it looked metallic, like your typical flying saucer type craft, she couldn't be certain it really was metal, or that it even was an actual physical craft. She told me she knows what she saw, but at the same time, she has no idea what she saw. For some reason, other families in the area started to treat us like we were all crazy. Well, maybe we actually were. Our life was crazy at the very least. And the key behind it all, the activating ingredient, the hand that turned the faucet on and off, was the Dogman. I'm not sure how or why, but the Dogman was the reason this was all happening. I think you could somehow take the poltergeist out, or the other apparent hauntings. You could take out the paranormal lights and the undead rising from the water. But the Dogman? The Dogman was the main ingredient behind all of it. Did I tell you about the Invisible Man? We had one of those too, maybe more than one. This was not a ghost. It was a very rude and very invisible guy. It would come into your room and start laughing at you. Sometimes I could tell what direction it was in, and one time I threw a book at it. I think I may have gotten it, but obviously I can't be certain because this guy is completely invisible. He makes noise just like anyone else, and when he speaks you can hear him. He doesn't show up to the naked eye, and he doesn't show up in mirrors except if you happen to catch him angled at just the right angle in a mirror. So I saw him one time in my room when I glanced at a mirror on my wall. It was a man, just like a man like anyone else. He had shaved that morning, I could see, as he had no beard. His hair was dark and short. He had light-colored skin. He was in my room wearing what looked like a scuba diving suit, I guess. He took a step forward and disappeared from the mirror. I kept trying to move around the room looking in that mirror, but was not able to once again get the correct angle to see him. Another time I saw him standing directly behind me in the bathroom when I angled the medicine cabinet mirror just right, and I screamed like I had never screamed before. Each time one of us would shout and freak out over a ghost or a Dogman, or being chased by one of those amoeba lights, or even having an invisible man standing directly behind us. My sister and I would get punished. My parents didn't like yelling and screaming, and they would punish you for it in various ways. To them, the problem wasn't all the paranormal phenomena. It was that my annoying sister and I refused to stop bothering them about it. I remember one time asking if they thought living next to that swamp was a normal way to live. I got punished just for asking the question. In our house, you even got punished for being curious. We finally moved out of there just randomly because a cousin of mine got my parents and my sister jobs in a store 2 states over. We all moved into an apartment that was way too small for us. My sister and I had to share a room. It was horrible, but we had literally just moved out of Hades itself, so we weren't complaining, and if we had, we'd have gotten punished for it anyway. I was out of there when I was 18, and my sister got married when she was 17 just to get away from them. Neither of us have the best life, but we're fairly sane considering the circumstances. She's moved to the West Coast, and I've moved to the East. We both are city dwellers now, both of us terrified of the dark, both of us still scared of lonely, unlit places. We're frightened of things that go bump in the night. We're scared that the dead might rise out of the swamp to walk. We're frightened of poltergeists, invisible intruders, and most of all, we fear the UFOs in Dogman Swamp.
Thank you so much for watching our extra long Halloween special. We hope you have the scariest and safest holiday ever.
Come see those American girls perform semi-live in hologram form on stage at the next Northeast Comic-Con. Meet Batman villains from the Gotham TV show. Watch Will Brierly's artificially intelligent cartoon character interview celebrities. See Debbie, Sophie, Alicia, and Chibi perform on stage. All this plus so much more.
Breaking news just added to the show are these stars. Dana DeLorenzo, star of Ash vs. the Evil Dead, the greatest horror comedy series that will ever be. Shake the hand that ended the second lives of so many Deadites. Also, Marty Ross of the New Monkeys, Denny Lane from Wings and the Moody Blues, co-writer of Mull of Kintyre. He will actually come hang out with us mortals.
Hosted by the king of pop culture himself, Gary Summers. That's the last weekend of November 2019 in Boxborough, Massachusetts, home of the Wolf People.
Dogman, piloting a UFO. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story that you will not believe, but I'm telling you this happened to me personally 10 years ago when my wife and I first moved into our apartment in a high-rise located in the city of Chicago, Illinois. I don't want to reveal the exact location this took place, but I've narrowed it down for you significantly. My story, although set in an urban area, might as well have been set in Wonderland or Magonia, as it makes little or no sense in the normal world. And this is because I saw a dogman piloting a UFO. As many UFO stories begin, mine began in bed. I was asleep, and some kind of strange humming woke me up. I thought maybe the heating was broken or that a truck was idling downstairs or something. It agitated me to the point that I finally got up to look around and figure out what was going on. As soon as I opened my eyes, I was pretty much blinded. I had to squint and slowly adjust to the intensely bright light that filled the room. I shook my wife to wake her, but she mumbled something about stop and went back to sleep. I got out of bed and could not just see the light coming in from behind the shades in our room. I could somehow feel it in my body. We had a big window that was covered with a thick floor-to-ceiling drape. Both filled an entire wall. The light outside was so intense that the room was more brightly lit than I had ever seen it, even with the shades completely drawn shut. What I was witnessing wasn't really possible. It didn't make any sense to me at all. I think I just sat there with my jaw hanging open, staring around at everything. I would look there, look here, look back there again. Nothing I saw made any sense at all. Nothing I saw had any coherence to it. I knew I had to get up and pull back that curtain, but I knew I wasn't going to like anything at all about what I was going to see on the other side. Well, of course, I pulled the shades back, and of course, I was once again blinded. I kept squinting into the light, not able to make out any details. I found my sunglasses and put them on, which helped a slight bit. I could now make out something hovering outside my window in the bright light. It seemed to be your typical flying saucer. I leaned forward and looked down on the street. This light was so bright inside my room. Was it lighting up the streets below as well? I couldn't really get a good angle to see when a window opened in the craft. I can't really explain how it opened. The saucer seemed seamless, and then there was a round portal in the center facing directly toward me. Inside was a man in a silvery metallic space suit, like something from Lost in Space, and he had the head of an Irish setter. I remember trying to ask questions, but my mind was spun in a circle. I tried to ask if I was seeing what I was seeing, or if someone was putting an image in my head of a dog piloting a UFO. I'm not a dog. I could feel it saying inside me. I'm a Shetland pony. But I looked at him, and he didn't look at all like a pony to me. He was a dog, not a horse. An Irish setter, to be specific. I looked at his hands, but they were covered in gloves. He seemed to have human hands, judging by the gloves, which looked like they might fit me. Then, I remember him suggesting to me that I was very tired. That was true. He had lied about being a pony, but he was telling the truth about how tired I was feeling. I laid back down in bed, and the next thing I knew, it was morning. People ask me if I experienced missing time, and I have to answer that I don't know. I didn't wake up any more tired than usual. If I had lost time that night, I must be being abducted every night. Of course, I guess that's not impossible. Or maybe it is, depending on who you ask about it. I hear a lot of people say a lot of things they want me to think is true. I don't believe any of it. I don't even believe my own eyes anymore. You know why? Because my eyes think they saw Dogman piloting a UFO. Hey, it's me, Henry Lee Dogman, here to thank those of you who support all of us here at Scary Stories NYC. It really helps us if you click like, and if you forward our videos or leave cool comments. If you can, it helps us even more when you let us share our 25 episode and growing collection of uncensored, scary Dogman stories with you by becoming a paid subscriber at peterbernard.com. That's right, join our monthly club and get 25 stories right off the bat, each of them wilder than what we're allowed to tell you on this channel. Then, each Sunday, get another new scary story, usually a Dogman story, but always uncensored and secret, available nowhere else on the planet. Please consider joining us today at peterbernard.com and keep the scary stories coming. Thanks, everyone.
Come back for more scary stories.